Hello everyone! So in the last episode we finished working on the player jump, and this time we'll be working on falling and air momentum. So let's make the transitions first inside the animator. So we'll add a new boolean parameter and we'll call it fall. And now let's make a transition from jump to fall. And let's click on it. So no exit time. The duration is 0. And the condition is gonna be that fall is true. And now instead of going from jump to idle, we can go from fall to idle and from fall to run. And we'll copy the same transitions. So instead of jump idle, it's gonna be fall idle. We will paste the transition and we will delete this one. And let's do the same thing. So we can copy the jump run transition parameters and just paste it here. Alright, and let's get rid of this one. Now back in our air movement script, let's create a bool called is falling. So private bool is falling. And let's then make a new function under the jump function. So private void fall. And in here we want to check if the player is going down. So we can check if the rigid body velocity on the y-axis is less than 0. So it means that we are going down. So in this case, we set our parameter. So set bool, the fall parameter is going to be true. And also we set our variable is falling to true. And one last thing to do here at the beginning of the function, to avoid setting the parameters multiple times, we can check if is falling is true, then we return. So all this code below will be ignored. Alright, now let's call the fall function in update. So after we jump, we fall. And finally, to reset our fall parameter and the is falling boolean, let's create a private void named air momentum. So in here, when the player is not grounded, so player controller dot collision detection dot is grounded, not grounded. So we will add the logic for our air momentum here, but else when we touch the ground, we first check if we are falling. So if is falling, to avoid checking when we're not jumping. So if this is true, we reset our fall parameter first. So set bool fall is gonna be false. And then we reset is falling to false. Now we can call this function after the fall function. So here, air momentum. Alright, so let's save and see how this works. So let's play. So let's try to jump. And as you can see, when going up, the jump animation is playing, and when going down, the fall animation is playing. Awesome! Now in the original game, the physics of falling after a jump is a bit different from the normal fall. So when falling after a jump, the player falls slowly with a linear velocity. But when falling off a platform, for example, the player falls really fast. We can achieve that by playing with the values of the gravity scale and linear drag of our rigid body. So first, let's create a private bool called jumped. And then inside the jump function, when we press the jump button, let's set it equal to true so that we know that our player has jumped. And then down inside the fall function, we can check if the player is falling after a jump or just falling off a platform. So after some testing, I came up with the values that feel so close to the original game. So for falling after a jump, let's set the rigid body drag to 2. And for falling off platforms, let's set it to 4. And also set the gravity scale to 9. Right? And finally, to reset all these values, let's go to the air momentum function. So in here, when the player is grounded after he falls, we set our drag back to 0. And the gravity scale to its initial value, which is 4.5. And we can, by the way, have a variable for this value. So let's make one. Serialize field, private, float, default, gravity, scale. And let's give it a value of 4.5. Now back in our function, we can use it. So after resetting the gravity scale, let's set the variable jumped to false. And then comes the fall parameter and the isFalling variable. So now let's save and see how this works. So we'll need a platform to test our falling. So here is the sprite for the floating platform we're gonna use. Of course, you can download it from the link in the description. So let's drag it into the environment folder under the sprites. And then we do the usual importing stuff. And we slice them by cell size, which is 16 by 16. That's it. Now let's drag it into the tile palette. So we go to Assets, Tiles, Ground, and select the folder. For now, we will use the ground collider tile map to paint, so make sure it's selected. And let's place some tiles. Okay, we're good to go. So let's hit play. So I'll try to jump first and see how the player falls. Alright. Now let's jump onto the platform and try to fall. And you can see we fell faster this time. And a small issue we can see here, our player gets stuck when I keep moving towards the platform. And we can fix that by having a physics material with no friction attached to the player collider. So in the assets folder, I'll create a new folder called Physics Materials. And here let's create a new physics material. So we go to create 2D, physics material 2D, and I'll name it player underscore no friction. And here we can set the friction to 0. Then let's click on our player and we can just drag it into the material property on the box collider. And that should do it. So let's see. Yeah, it's fine now. Very nice. Now let's move on to the air momentum. So let's see first how it works in the original game. So when the player is in the air, if you press the right or left directions once and then let go, the player will keep going in this direction until you're grounded again. Another thing is that the movement speed in the air is different than the one on the ground. So let's go back to the air movement script and see how we can do that. Alright, so first let's create two booleans. So public bool, I'll name the first one moving right. And the second one moving left. Now down inside the air momentum function, when the player is not grounded, we check if the right direction key has been pressed. So if player input dot horizontal movement is greater than 0, so in this case we set moving right to true and moving left to false. And else if the left direction key has been pressed, so player controller dot player input dot horizontal movement is less than 0, we set moving left to true and moving right to false. And one more thing we should not forget is flipping our player. So here when we move right, we set the local scale to a new vector 3, and we have 1 on the x-axis. Alright, and when we move left, we can set it to a new vector 3, but with -1 on the x. And now for the movement speed, we should make it less than the movement speed on ground. So let's go to the top and create a serialized field, private float, and I'm gonna call it air movement speed, and I'll give it a default value of 4. And by the way, let's make both the jump time and the jump time counter private, so we don't need them to be public. But we can add serialized field to the jump time because we should be able to change it in the inspector. Alright, and now back in our function. When you're not grounded, let's set the player movement speed to the air movement speed. And down here, when the player touches the ground, we can set it back to its initial value. So let's go to the ground movement script. And at the top here, let's add a public float and I'm gonna call it ground movement speed, and we'll give it a default value of 8. And in start, when we start the game, let's set the player movement speed to the ground movement speed. Okay, and one more thing we gotta do in this script here before we leave. So in update, we don't want to have any ground movement unless we're grounded. So let's check if we are grounded. Actually, if we're not grounded, let's return. So this basically tells Unity to ignore this code when we're not grounded. But we have a little problem. The restrict player movement function will be ignored too, and we don't want that. So let's take it out of here and move it to the player controller script. And previously we called it in update, which is not the optimal way. That's why let's call it in LateUpdate this time. So LateUpdate works in exactly the same way as update, except that it's always called after update. And since the order that the code is executed cannot be guaranteed when using just update alone, using LateUpdate can help us prevent bugs. So if we take a look at our function, we can see that we need to get the camera bounds, which are actually being changed each frame in update in the camera controller script. So that's why it's really optimal to clamp the player position in LateUpdate after the camera bounds have been changed. Alright, now let's go back to the air movement script. So when we touch the ground, we set the player movement speed equal to the ground movement speed. So let's get it from player controller, ground movement speed. And we also need to cancel the momentum. So let's set both moving left and moving right to false. Alright, so we haven't implemented the movement yet. So here, when we're not grounded, after we get our input, let's check if moving right is true. Our player should keep moving to the right. So we set our rigid body velocity equal to a new vector 2. So the horizontal velocity will be equal to the movement speed, and the vertical one will not change. So we can just type player controller.rb.velocity.y. Alright, and then if moving left is true, we can just copy this line and just add a minus sign here. Very nice. Now let's save everything and switch back to Unity. So if I jump and tab right, you can see the player keeps moving even though I'm not pressing the right key, and the same when I press left. Oh yeah, we can see that there is a problem with flipping. So let's try to fix it. So back in the air movement script, here when we flip the player, we forgot to change the forward direction. So let's do it. So when we flip to the right, we set it equal to 1. And here, we set it equal to -1. So let's save and see. Yeah, it's fine now. So that's it guys for this one. Next time we will be handling the player collision in air. I hope you find this video useful. If you have, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next episodes. Never forget to save your projects, and I'll see you next time.